looking at me like I'm about to share a poem. I'm not. Today is a good day. It's a wonderful occasion. And I'm privileged to stand in front of you to share with you one of the concepts that has ultimately changed how I think about my future. I'm not a sangoma, no, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you what I think is your future. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I present to you your future. Isn't that beautiful? Amazing. Ah. Why do you all look lost? You can't see, you seriously can't see this? Wow. This was supposed to be like my eureka moment. You're just supposed to get it, stand up, give me a standing ovation, speech done. All right. Let's do this like normal people, shall we? My name is Mwanangwa Zombe. I'm an economist as well as a poet, and I'm just here to showcase my public speaking skills. Speaking of public speaking, recently I started teaching a public speaking class with about 15 students. And one of the biggest problems that they claim to face is handling nerves in front of people. Now, personally, I don't have any problems handling my nerves in front of people. The problem comes in when I'm standing in front of my crush. I don't know what happens, but everything just goes berserk. I think the gentleman in the house will probably agree with me. You know, when you're just about to talk the woman of your dreams, you have this conversation literally mapped out in your mind how it's all going to go. You know, it's going to start with the hello. Hi. How are you? I'm okay, thank you. How are you? Just wanted to say, I love you. Oh, I love you too. And they lived happily ever after. What's the problem, ladies? Stick to the script. You know, when I was in grade 11, I had a crush. I had the crush on this grade 10 damsel. Oh, what a fairy tale she was. You know, sometimes I'll stare so long into her sunset beach brown eyes, and I'll get lost in them, and I would watch her blink in slow motion, inwardly hoping that each blink would cleanse her eyes so she could see that I was the one. And she loved poetry. And I didn't stumble on poetry until she came along. And at that moment, she became the poem that I wanted to recite on one cold Sunday morning when I was pledging my vows to her. She was the poem I wanted to memorize for each and every line, every word for the rest of my life. But no, she was a silly girl. She really loved poetry. And I only decided to write it to impress her. Or maybe I was just too shy to actually express my feelings in front of her, but that's for you to argue. 11 years later, I am one of the co-founders of Black Pith Zambia with two other great guys, which is one of Zambia's biggest poetry organizations right now. And me and my crush, well, we're nothing more than a testimony of a failed romance. In short, she said no 11 years ago. And it makes me wonder, why am I still passionate about poetry? Am I holding on to a failed romance that happened almost more than a decade ago? Or maybe, just maybe, I actually found my voice by finding myself in a poem. Now, when I was researching on the importance of poetry, I came across an interesting quote. And they said, as long as there is pain and people hurt in the world, then poetry will still have its meaning. Now today there's a growing number of poets and poetry enthusiasts, so it kind of makes you wonder how much pain is going in and around our society. When I started writing poetry, I first thought it was a language of lovers. Explicitly written lines, perfectly picked words that perfectly arouse emotions that have raised generations. One of my lecturers defined poetry as something more explicit than sex, because it undresses your heart's emotions as an insecure lover. I think he was just dirty-minded. But he had a point though. Because art has a way of literally stripping you of how you feel and presenting yourself in your honest sense. Now, when I started writing poetry, I declared a love that never was. When I was rejected, I wrote a poem that reminded me of my self-worth, and I was still worth it despite the rejection. After which I continued writing more poems describing each and every mental health challenge I kept facing. Speak of stress, speak of depression, speak of motivation, speak of self-confidence. Excuse me. I wrote many poems like that. And there are many poets like me. Poets who pen their lyrics from experiences that they have faced that have hurt them for their lives. Poetry and poetry enthusiasts that find their stories told in something as simple as words. Now, we've, over the course of 3 years as Black Pith Zambia, have used poetry as a form of therapy. And I recall when I was reading an article from the BBC, there was a reporter called Alex Hudson. He was trying to find the relationship between poetry and mental health. And he posed a very interesting question. Is it mental illness that draws people to art? Or is it art that draws people to mental illness? I found that rather peculiar. And our works as Black Pith has started probably around 2015, when we had our first sessions at Kalulushi Trust School with the young kids in secondary schools. And we shared poems with them, got to analyze with them, and grow with them through this form of therapy. In 2017, we grew it to Mpelembe Secondary School here in Kitwe, where we have more kids joining up and learning from this unique art. And the most interesting thing for me and for this session, last year in 2018, we did a pilot test on the effectiveness of poetry therapy on inmates, because we believe poetry is for everybody. So we said, let's try it on inmates. Let's see if this actually works. So we did a pilot test in Solwezi at the rehabilitation center in Solwezi. And we had a couple of inmates. And in the first sessions, you could tell that these guys were feeling oppressed. You know how it is, you're in jail, you're thinking, I'm in jail, I need to be out there. And that was the mentality that they had as well. Halfway into the program, their perception begins to change. They no longer feel oppressed, but they feel like they're actually in there because they deserve to be there. In a true sense, you're in jail because you committed a crime. Why do you want to go back outside? But halfway in, they're like, I can't go outside without just changing myself. From the poems that were being shared. And one touching moment was when one of the inmates told us that being in jail was one of the biggest blessings that ever happened to him and his family. Because it finally gave him something to reflect on and focus on the most important things in life. And then you would wonder, you would argue how poetry can be used as therapy. You could argue the power of poetry, but you can definitely not argue the power of words. Today, we're literally sharing our ideas simply by words. Yes, we're using our PowerPoints, but the thing that's selling the idea is simply our words. So words are powerful. And poetry simply picks the most powerful words and scripts them into a story that digs deep into our emotions. And you would wonder how do we actually do it? How do we conduct poetry therapy? Poetry therapy is done within a very short period of time. We try to keep it short, simple, and straight to the point. People get bored easily. So you want to do it quickly. We have small groups. We like to work with smaller groups so it can be more personal. And within these groups, we simply do three things. We read, analyze, and understand. We encourage people to write their stories through simple poetry mediums, not really focusing on the technical aspect of poetry, but the most important thing is sharing your feelings. So they write their feelings through the same poetry, and they get to share with their friends, and everybody gets to interact and talk about this. Within this instance, the process is to understand the poem, but ultimately it helps you understand the emotion. And by so doing, you separate the individual from the emotion. If you, for example, have a violent person, the violent person no longer becomes an image. You separate the person to the violence, and you can analyze the violence individually. And any time when a violent person feels violent, they're able to understand, okay, violence looks like this, I'm violent because of this and that. and that begins to help them in the long run. We never dictate the outcome. The individual dictates their own outcome. The example I gave for the inmates, when we started the program, we never at one point told them, we want you to be hopeful. But the hope came from within, from being able to admit that they did wrong, for them admitting that they need to be better, for them admitting to say, when I go out, I need to be a better person. For we believe that if you admit from yourself or the emotion comes from within, it is stronger than being told. So no matter how much inspiration we tell you today, if it's not going to come from yourself, it's going to end by the time you leave the door. Probably hoping just to get a few numbers and that's it. So there's about 34% of emergency cases that are reported by the University Teaching Hospital in Zambia. 34% of them are caused by self-harm, mostly by stress and depression amongst young people. And today I see a lot of young people. So we cannot argue or ignore the fact that mental illness or mental challenges are a problem within our communities. And you look at poetry and say, why poetry? In Zambia, when you look at mental health challenges, you're probably relating it to the 50 bed spaces in Chainama Hills Hospital, and it usually draws stigma and discrimination. But with poetry, you're looking at something that is fun, artistic, and enjoyable. I'll listen to a poem that attracts me or makes me feel emotional. And instead of saying that it has touched my problem, I would rather say it's deep and snap. I would write a poem that people will say is a lovely piece. They will not understand how far it took me from to reach that poem. And they'll just say it's deep because they enjoyed it. So it's a fun way of saying, I am not okay, but I am dealing with it. Now, we can always argue about how poetry can be used or how different types of arts can be used to help solve such problems. But the fact is, at one point in our lives, each and every one of us is going to stumble upon a problem. And I'm not wishing you ill. I don't want you to stumble upon problems, but it's a reality of the world we live in today. We have mental challenges. Sometimes we're stressed with work. Our relationships get us depressed. Rejections affect us. There is so much emotion around the world today, but we have very little outlets that are provided by society. We don't talk, we just absorb it. How many of us actually have an outlet when we have a mental health challenge? Do we have anybody to speak to? I see a lot of posts on social media asking men and women to speak up about issues of gender-based violence, about violence itself, rape, abuse, and a lot of mediums. But speaking itself is not really, it's a beginning of healing. So how else do we find a platform that creates that healing process? And we have seen the usefulness in something as simple as a poem, where people can just be honest to say, I am not okay, but I am dealing with it. Now, in the beginning of my presentation, I showed you this image, and I said this was your future. Some of you looked at this and saw a blank image. Some of you thought maybe he's missed the slide. Some of you probably thought he's going to explain some more. Some of you focused on the blemish at the top corner, and some of you saw the dot at the bottom corner. But that's the future we live in. It's not specified. With words, with the ink in our pens, we're able to tell our own stories. You might be the little dot in the corner and you're looking up and seeing so much space and not knowing what to do with your lives. But it's your story, and that's your canvas to write. You might look at the imperfection in your future, but that's your imperfection. It's up to you to whether focus on your imperfections or focus on the space where you can tell your story much better. So this indeed is your future. Now, before I leave, I'd like to share with you a piece. Maybe, just maybe, this pen, this ink, is the only way I can speak to you. Maybe this pen and this paper listens to me in ways that you may never will, because I am only human. And I think sometimes you forget that I cry, that I bleed just like you. And one day my heart will bleed, and you will watch me die like a performance, watching me burn without ashes, for my soul died way before the fire. And you will ask, and try to find reason why the flames were ignited, but you will not smell the gasoline in your hands or the matchstick in your tongue. So if tonight doesn't kill me, tomorrow the sun will be my resurgence, and I'll be in the shadow to make my confessions that I am not okay, but I am dealing with it. Thank you.